My name is Madeline Archer. I'm 33, and 6 weeks before my wedding, I heard my fiancé planning another woman's future inside a building that belonged to me. Until that Thursday, I thought the hardest part of getting married would be finalizing the guest list and keeping Connor from adding another restaurant investor to the reception. We had been together for 13 years. Long enough that everyone around us treated the wedding like paperwork for a life already decided. The building was a bakery in Philadelphia that my aunt left to me, and I had spent 4 years bringing it back to life. My plan was to turn most of it into a culinary training space, but Connor had been pushing to use the ground floor for a flagship restaurant his company wanted to open. I agreed to let his team study the idea. Nothing more. No lease was signed. No tenant approved, and I had never promised anyone an office, kitchen, or place upstairs. That evening, I arrived early to meet a contractor about the ventilation system. Crossing the ground floor, I heard Connor in the test kitchen with Sabrina Cole, the woman he always described as just a business collaborator. They were discussing menus, an office for her, and the third-floor studio as if everything had already been decided. Then Sabrina asked the question that stopped me before I reached the doorway. She asked if I had actually agreed to let her run the place after the wedding. Connor told her not to worry. He said I might be annoyed, but after 13 years and a wedding that close, I wasn't going to blow up my life over one restaurant. Then he added, "Once we're married, she'll stop treating the building like it's only hers." I stood there without moving. The worst part was not hearing Sabrina's name attached to my building. It was hearing how certain Connor sounded about me, as if our history had become permission he no longer needed to ask for. For 13 years, he had never needed to know whether I could leave. He had built everything around believing I wouldn't. I waited until Connor came home that night. I did not ask whether he loved Sabrina, whether they had kissed, or whether I had missed some secret relationship. I asked one question instead. "What have you promised her about my building?" Connor stopped near the kitchen counter and looked at me. His first response was to ask why I had been listening to a conversation. I told him that was not an answer. Then I asked again what exactly he had promised Sabrina. He said the restaurant was only a concept, and Sabrina had experience launching new locations. I asked about the office she believed would be hers, and he called it temporary workspace. I asked about the third-floor studio, and he admitted he had mentioned she could use it when late nights made commuting difficult. Then I asked why she believed she would run the restaurant after our wedding. That was where his explanations started changing shape. Connor said business was business, and our marriage was separate. But I reminded him that he had used our marriage to make Sabrina trust his promises. He rubbed his hands over his face and said I was turning planning into betrayal. Then he told me we could put better boundaries in place once we were married. I looked at him and understood why every conversation about Sabrina had felt impossible. He kept asking me to accept something now because he promised to respect me later. I told him that if I had to marry him before he respected the word no, then I should not marry him at all. Connor stared at me like I had changed the subject, but I had not. I took off my engagement ring and placed it in the drawer. I told him the wedding was over and that I wanted him to stay elsewhere that night. He said I was angry, that I was making a permanent decision over something fixable, and that he would give me a few days to calm down. I told him he was doing it again, taking my decision and turning it into an emotion he believed he could wait out. The next morning, I met Miles Dorsey at the building before the contractors arrived. I asked him to freeze every restaurant plan connected to Connor and pull every document tied to access, construction, and tenant approval. Miles did not ask why or soften anything. He opened the project folder and showed me that no lease had been finalized. No tenant agreement had been signed, and no one had approved the third-floor studio for residential use. Connor had been planning far beyond anything I had actually authorized. The deeper we looked, the clearer the pattern became. A materials board had Sabrina's name on it. A contractor had priced out a private office, and a designer had already mocked up a tasting room for her concept. none of it was illegal. And Connor had not forged my signature or hidden a signed contract from me. He had simply kept moving forward as if my eventual yes was guaranteed. That was the part that bothered me most, because he had turned my silence into permission without ever asking what I wanted. Later that afternoon, I met Bethany Pierce for coffee and told her everything that Miles and I had found. I admitted that part of me still felt foolish because I did not have some dramatic proof that Connor and Sabrina were having a physical affair. Bethany listened without interrupting, then asked me something I could not dismiss. If every choice he made depended on believing you would never leave, what more do you need to know about how he sees your boundaries? I sat with that question much longer than I expected that afternoon. By evening, Connor had started calling the project Freeze Retaliation. He told Miles that once I calmed down, we would all get back to the original plan, and he sent word that he would talk to me when I was ready to be reasonable. I did not answer him. Instead, I asked Miles to reopen the old feasibility file for the culinary apprenticeship program I had wanted on the ground floor before Connor proposed his flagship restaurant. For the first time in months, I stopped asking how much space I could make for Connor's future and started looking at the one I had postponed for myself. Sabrina found me 2 days later during a community preview at the building. She waited until I stepped away from a group of teachers, then asked whether the restaurant had been stopped because of her or because of Connor. I told her it had been stopped because it had never been approved. Her face changed slightly, like she had expected anger instead. She said Connor had told her that once we were married, there would be more flexibility with the building. He had also told her she would lead the concept, choose the kitchen team, and use the third-floor studio when late nights made the commute difficult. I told her Connor was free to promise his own time, money, and career. He was not free to promise space that belonged to me. Sabrina looked toward the unfinished kitchen and asked if none of those plans had ever been mine. I said that was exactly what I was saying. She was quiet for a moment, then told me Connor had made everything sound settled, as if the wedding was the only thing standing between the proposal and a final yes. I told her there was no wedding anymore. Sabrina looked at me carefully and said she thought Connor and I would work things out once things cooled down. I told her there was nothing left for me to cool down from. After that, the questions shifted toward Connor. Sabrina asked him when they could stop calling each other collaborators and start being honest about what they were. Connor told her everything was too messy and that making anything public would make the situation worse. She reminded him that he had always said I was the reason they had to wait. Now I was gone, and he still could not tell her what came next. For months, both of them had treated me like the obstacle between them and the future they imagined. Once I stepped out of the middle, neither of them could use me as the explanation anymore. Sabrina wanted a direct answer, and Connor suddenly needed more time. That was when I understood their future had never been waiting for me to move. It had been waiting for Connor to choose, and he still had not made that choice. Connor still believed the breakup was temporary because the date that had once belonged to our wedding was still sitting on the calendar. I had canceled the ceremony, but I had not released every reservation connected to the welcome dinner we planned inside the building. Some deposits for catering, rentals, and staffing could be transferred instead of lost. So I decided to use that evening for the soft opening of the culinary apprenticeship program I had postponed for his restaurant. Miles and I rebuilt the event around something that had existed long before Connor's proposal. We invited vocational teachers, restaurant owners, families, and the first group of young people interested in the program. There was no press campaign, no announcement about my breakup, and nothing designed to embarrass anyone. It was simply the first night the ground floor would be used for the purpose I had originally imagined. Connor heard that the date was still active and took it as proof that I was not finished with him. His mother later told me he kept saying I would never preserve that weekend unless some part of me expected him to come back. She told him that a date remaining on a calendar did not mean a person remained in someone's life. Connor apparently answered that I was trying to force him to choose. A week before the opening, he came to the building while I was reviewing the kitchen layout with Miles. Connor waited until Miles stepped away, then asked if I was really turning our wedding weekend into this just to punish him. I told him the apprenticeship program had been my plan before he ever suggested a flagship restaurant. I had moved it aside because I thought marriage meant making room for his future too. Connor folded his arms and said, "So this is revenge." I looked around at the training stations, the unfinished counters, and the rooms I had spent years trying to restore. "No," I told him. "This is what was here before I moved it aside for you." For the first time, Connor did not answer immediately. He looked past me toward the kitchen as if he were finally seeing something that had been invisible while he believed it belonged inside his plans. I had not created a new life to punish him. I had simply stopped delaying one that was already mine. Connor had more than one chance to understand what was happening. The first came when his project team received notice that the restaurant concept was no longer under consideration. Any demo equipment stored there had to be collected before the end of the week. Connor treated it like another pressure tactic and told a manager to handle the pickup. The second chance came from his mother. She called him after receiving an invitation to the soft opening and told him what the evening was for. Connor asked whether I had mentioned him or said anything about the canceled wedding. When she told him, I had not. He decided that was proof I wanted his family there so he could see how well I was doing without him. His mother told him not everything I did was a message meant for him. Connor still believed the date mattered too much to be accidental. In his mind, keeping that evening alive meant I had kept some part of our future alive too. He could not imagine that I had taken the date back for myself, because that would mean the decision had already moved beyond him. The third chance came from Sabrina. She told Connor she would not attend the opening with him because she was tired of standing inside a situation where every conversation still came back to me. Connor asked why she was pulling away when he needed her to stand beside him. Sabrina told him that was exactly the problem. He always wanted someone beside him, but he never said where he was actually going. The night before the event, Connor found the last pieces of the restaurant plan waiting for pickup. Sabrina had returned her access card, sample menus, and the material boards that once carried her name. Connor looked at everything and still convinced himself that the opening was the moment when I would finally sit down and talk. He decided to come without asking me first. The next afternoon, he put on the suit he had originally ordered for our welcome dinner. To Connor, showing up did not feel like crossing a boundary because he still believed the boundary was temporary. 13 years had trained him to see every disagreement as something we would eventually negotiate inside the relationship. What he still had not accepted was that the relationship itself was no longer open for negotiation. Connor arrived at the building when our welcome dinner was supposed to begin. He wore the dark suit he had ordered months earlier and looked like a man walking into a future he recognized. Then he stepped through the doors and saw what the ground floor had become. There was no restaurant branding, no tasting room with Sabrina's name, and nothing that belonged to his company. Instead, the space was filled with training stations, apprentices meeting restaurant owners, and families standing beside the people they came to support. Miles met Connor near the entrance and told him he was welcome because I had never asked that he be removed from the family guest list. Connor asked if he could use the back hallway to find me. Miles told him that area was restricted to staff and participants. I found Connor near the kitchen entrance. He looked around and asked if I had replaced everything in 6 weeks. I told him most of what he was seeing had been planned long before his restaurant proposal. The only thing I had done in 6 weeks was stop postponing it. Connor lowered his voice and asked if I was willing to throw away 13 years because of Sabrina. I told him this was not about Sabrina, and it never really had been. Even if she had disappeared the night I overheard them, the problem would still be there. He had planned my future, my property, and my answer around the belief that I would eventually give him whatever yes he needed. For once, Connor did not interrupt me. He said he never thought I would actually leave. And the words sounded different now that he was standing inside a room that had moved forward without him. I looked at him and said, I know. That was the part I finally believed. He stared at me as if he understood that I had not built this evening to punish him. I had not invited people there so he could watch me prove I was fine. I had simply stopped designing my choices around what he expected from me. Then, I turned back toward the apprentices and left Connor standing outside, a future he had assumed would always make room for him. 2 days after the opening, Sabrina met Connor and returned the last access card she still had. She asked him one question she had avoided for months, if I was truly gone. Did he actually want a life with her? Connor did not answer right away. Sabrina understood before he said anything that she had not been waiting for me to move aside. She had been waiting for him to make a choice he never intended to make. A few weeks later, Connor asked to meet me at a small diner near my office. He told me he finally understood that he liked feeling needed by Sabrina and liked believing I would always be the stable part of his life. He had confused my loyalty with a guarantee. I told him that was exactly why the relationship ended, because every boundary I set had slowly become something he expected to negotiate until I gave in. Connor asked whether things might have been different if he had ended everything with Sabrina the night I overheard them. I told him maybe the next conversation would have been different, but he had not done that. At the time, he was still asking how much of both lives he could keep, instead of asking what his choices were doing to either of us. He nodded, and for once, he did not try to turn my answer into the beginning of another discussion. A few months later, the first apprenticeship class started in the kitchen Connor had once promised to Sabrina. I watched the students prepare their first dinner for real guests and realized I did not feel like I had beaten anyone. The room had simply returned to the purpose I had chosen before I started moving my plans aside for someone else. I used to think leaving a 13-year relationship meant admitting those years had been wasted. But I finally understood that time already spent is not a deposit that requires you to pay for it with the rest of your future too.